When people talk about wealth in Hollywood today, they think of streaming deals, luxury homes, and billion-dollar franchises. But long before social media, long before celebrity brand empires, Johnny Carson used to say, "You think these folks today have money?" Some of the old-timers could have bought the studios twice over, and he wasn't exaggerating. Behind the cameras of Hollywood's golden age were actors and actresses who quietly built fortunes so massive, even modern stars would be left speechless. These weren't just performers. They were pioneers. They didn't flaunt their success. They built it quietly, carefully, and often long before anyone realized what they were doing. Carson, who met and interviewed countless stars during his career, always had a soft spot for the legends of old Hollywood. He admired how their charm masked sharp business instincts, how they could make a studio laugh on Friday night and buy half of Los Angeles by Monday morning. In classic Carson fashion, he'd joke about it on The Tonight Show. "You know, some of those stars made so much money, even their money had money." It always got a laugh, but Johnny meant every word. The truth was, behind the glitz and glamour, many of these screen legends were financial masterminds. They were buying real estate while others were buying champagne. They were investing in oil, aviation, and land when nobody else saw the value. And while their names lit up marquees, their fortunes quietly built the foundations of modern Hollywood wealth. Johnny Carson often said he respected the thinkers, the stars who didn't just act, but planned, those who understood that fame fades, but smart investments last forever. And he wasn't alone. Anyone who knew the industry back then could tell you that some of these stars made their real magic off the screen. Tonight, we're looking back at 7 of those legends. The ones Johnny admired, laughed with, and spoke about with a mix of awe and amusement. 7 stars who turned talent into dynasties, and fame into fortunes that outlived them all. From the poor tramp who secretly became a billionaire, to the sweetheart who built her own empire, and the comedian who made millions pretending to be broke. As Carson once put it, they didn't just make people laugh or cry. They made money while doing it, and they made it look easy. These are the 7 old Hollywood legends who secretly died filthy rich. And as Johnny would say, number 3, well, that one even surprised me. Johnny Carson once said that Charlie Chaplin was the only man who could play a poor tramp and still live like a king. And he was right. To the world, Chaplin was the lovable underdog, the man with the bowler hat, the cane, and that famous little mustache who made millions laugh without ever saying a word. But off-screen, Chaplin was one of the sharpest financial minds Hollywood ever saw. He didn't just act in movies, he owned them. At a time when most stars were signing away their rights for a paycheck, Chaplin was quietly collecting ownership of his films, keeping the profits that studios thought would never last. By the mid-1920s, he wasn't just the biggest star in Hollywood. He was his own studio, his own distributor, and his own boss. Carson once joked that Chaplin was the only man in Hollywood who could argue with a producer and win. But that confidence came from real power. Chaplin's deals were revolutionary. He didn't just earn a salary, he earned ownership. And that ownership kept paying for decades, even after most of his peers were forgotten by the industry. What's even more fascinating is where Chaplin put his money. He wasn't just investing in film. He was buying up land, oil fields, and patents that would become the backbone of 20th century technology. One of his smartest moves was investing in oil drilling equipment. Not the oil itself, but the tools every company needed. Every time someone struck oil, a small piece of that success trickled right back to Chaplin. Carson loved that kind of story. The kind where the poor man turns out to be the smartest one in the room. He often said Chaplin's real genius wasn't just making people laugh, but making his laughter pay compound interest. And here's the kicker. When Chaplin was exiled from the United States during the McCarthy era, his fortune barely noticed. He had already structured his wealth across countries, companies, and trusts that made him untouchable. While politicians tried to silence him, his bank accounts kept working overtime. By the time of his death in 1977, Chaplin's estimated fortune was around $100 million, over $2 billion in today's money. Not bad for a man who once played a tramp picking up pennies off the street. Johnny Carson once looked back on Chaplin's story during a Tonight Show anniversary special. He smiled and said, "The little tramp never needed a big paycheck because he knew how to turn a nickel into a million." And if you think Chaplin's story was impressive, wait until you hear about the woman who built an entire Hollywood empire with her charm, her brains, and a pen. Up next, the queen of silent cinema who ran circles around the men who tried to control her, Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart who built an empire. Johnny Carson once called her the woman who could melt hearts on screen and melt steel in a business meeting. That was Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, the girl with the golden curls, and one of the shrewdest business minds Hollywood ever produced. Most people remember her as the innocent face of silent cinema, the damsel, the dreamer, the perfect picture of old Hollywood charm. But what they don't know is that behind that angelic smile was a woman who understood the business of fame better than anyone in her era. At a time when actresses were treated as replaceable, Mary Pickford was negotiating contracts that made studio executives nervous. In 1916, she became the highest-paid woman in the world, earning $10,000 a week, plus a share of her film's profits. And when that still wasn't enough control, she did something unheard of. She stopped waiting for the studios to give her power and built her own. In 1919, Pickford joined forces with three of Hollywood's biggest names, Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith, to form United Artists. It was revolutionary. For the first time, actors and filmmakers could produce and distribute their own movies without being at the mercy of the studios. Carson later joked, "Mary didn't just act in Hollywood. She owned it, one reel at a time." And he wasn't wrong. While others were fighting for better salaries, Pickford was collecting ownership stakes. While others spent their money on mansions, she was buying land, prime California property that would become some of the most valuable real estate in the industry. Her smartest investment was in Burbank, blocks of land that would later turn into studio property worth hundreds of millions. She didn't just know how to make audiences fall in love with her. She knew how to make money fall in love with time. Carson once reflected on that in an interview, saying Mary Pickford was the kind of woman who could charm you, out-negotiate you, and then thank you with a smile for letting her win, and the best part? You'd thank her right back. By the time she retired, Pickford wasn't just a movie star, she was a mogul. Her fortune, when adjusted for today's money, was worth nearly $2 billion. She had built her empire on talent, timing, and sheer determination in an industry that rarely gave women either credit or control. Johnny admired that about her. He often said that Hollywood's early days were full of dreamers, but Mary was different. She didn't just dream, she signed the checks that made dreams possible. And while America knew her as its sweetheart, Hollywood insiders knew better. Behind the soft voice and the curls was one of the toughest minds in show business history. But as Carson used to tease on his show, if you think she was the only silent star with a golden bank account, wait until you hear about the one who outsmarted the studios, the tax man, and half of California. Up next, the man who hung from a clock and ended up owning more land than most oil barons, Harold Lloyd, the forgotten billionaire of silent film. Johnny Carson once said, "Everyone remembers Chaplin. A few remember Keaton. But Harold Lloyd? He remembered to invest." And that simple truth might be what separates Harold Lloyd from every other silent film legend. Because while most stars of his time were spending their fortunes, Lloyd was quietly building one that would outlast them all. To most audiences, Harold Lloyd was the fearless daredevil, the man hanging from a clock tower in safety last, risking his life for laughs. But behind the camera, he was a strategist, a businessman, and one of Hollywood's earliest self-made millionaires. Unlike many of his peers, Lloyd didn't just perform. He owned everything he touched. He ran his own production company, controlled his own distribution, and even managed his own publicity. That independence meant he kept nearly 85% of the profits from his films, a percentage that made studio heads grind their teeth. Carson once joked, "If Chaplin was the artist, Harold was the accountant. And trust me, the accountant always wins." But Lloyd's real genius wasn't just in the movie business. It was in what he did after the cameras stopped rolling. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, most of Hollywood panicked. Lloyd didn't. Instead of hoarding cash, he started buying land. And not just any land. Farmland, ranches, and properties across California's Central Valley that most people considered worthless. What nobody realized then was that those properties came with water rights, the real gold of the West. When California's population exploded after World War II, those water rights turned into one of the most valuable assets in the entire state. By the 1940s, Harold Lloyd wasn't just a movie star. He was financing small film studios, lending money to producers, and quietly operating a shadow network of investments that stretched from agriculture to real estate to film production. One Hollywood historian once said, "He was like a one-man bank hiding in plain sight." Carson admired that. He often told his audience that Harold Lloyd was proof that sometimes the funniest man in the room is also the smartest investor in the room. And it's true. While other silent film icons lost their fortunes to bad investments, Harold's grew larger every decade. What's more impressive is how discreet he was about it. He never bragged. He never flaunted it. His name wasn't on skyscrapers or studio gates. It was buried in property records and holding companies no one paid attention to. Even close friends were shocked when, after his death, auditors realized how much he'd left behind. By 1971, Harold Lloyd's estate was worth roughly $75 million, around $1.6 billion today. It was one of the largest private fortunes in entertainment history, built not on scandal or luck, but on patience, planning, and pure discipline. Johnny Carson summed it up best during a conversation with an old Hollywood historian in the early 80s. He leaned back, smiled, and said, "Chaplin made the world laugh. Harold made sure it paid for the encore, and it did. But while Harold Lloyd quietly built his empire from behind the scenes, the next star on Johnny's list didn't believe in being quiet about anything. She turned controversy into cash, and even used censorship to make herself a millionaire. Up next, the one and only Mae West, the woman who outsmarted Hollywood and bought Las Vegas. Johnny Carson used to say that Mae West was proof you could get rich just by being yourself, as long as yourself could outtalk every man in the room. And that's exactly what she did. Mae West was one of the boldest, most controversial women in entertainment history. She was famous for her curves, her wit, and that unmistakable voice that made even a simple hello sound like a headline. But behind the jokes and double entendre, Mae West was one of Hollywood's earliest self-made millionaires and one of its smartest businesswomen. Her rise began in the 1920s, when she wrote and starred in her own plays. Many of them so scandalous, they got her arrested for corrupting public morals. Carson once joked, she didn't just break the rules. She rewrote them, printed copies, and sold them at the box office. And that's not far from the truth. Mae understood something few performers did back then. That controversy was currency. Every time the public tried to silence her, she got more famous. Every time the press called her indecent, ticket sales doubled. When she came to Hollywood, she negotiated one of the best contracts ever written for an actress at the time. Not only did she secure creative control, but she also owned the rights to her scripts and her image. In an era when studios controlled everything, Mae West controlled Mae West. Carson often admired that, saying she was decades ahead of her time, the kind of woman who'd turn a scandal into a business plan. And while her films made millions, her smartest move came during the Great Depression. When she started buying property, while others were losing their homes, Mae was buying entire apartment buildings in Los Angeles, Hollywood, and even Las Vegas. She saw what others didn't. That real estate, especially around entertainment hubs, would never go out of style. By the 1950s, she owned a stretch of commercial real estate in Las Vegas, property that exploded in value as the city became a global destination. It's said that by the time she passed away, her portfolio was worth more than $60 million, roughly $1.3 billion today. Carson once shared a story from a producer who had worked with May in her later years. When he asked her why she invested in property instead of the stock market, she smirked and said, "You can't live in a stock certificate, honey." That was Mae West. Sharp, funny, and completely in control. She turned every weakness into a punchline, and every punchline into a profit. Carson loved that kind of brilliance, the kind wrapped in wit and delivered with a wink. He often said that Mae West was one of those people who never pretended to be humble. And somehow, that honesty made her even more powerful. By the time she passed away in 1980, Mae had outlasted her critics, her censors, and even most of her fans' expectations. She left behind not just movies and one-liners, but an empire, built one clever remark and one property deed at a time. Carson's take? She made the world blush and the banks smile. And he was right. But while Mae West made her millions with boldness and flair, the next name on Johnny's list made his fortune with elegance and restraint. A man so smooth, so sophisticated, he turned charm itself into currency. Up next, Cary Grant, the gentleman who quietly became a mogul. Johnny Carson once said, "Cary Grant was the kind of man who could make you feel underdressed in a tuxedo and somehow still make you want to thank him for it." That charm wasn't just for the camera, it was a business strategy. Cary Grant was the very definition of sophistication. The accent, the posture, the effortless smile. But behind the screen, he was one of Hollywood's most financially savvy actors. He didn't just play the gentleman millionaire, he became one. While other stars were chasing bigger salaries, Cary Grant was rewriting how actors got paid. In the 1930s, when studios offered flat fees, Grant came up with an idea that changed Hollywood forever. He negotiated smaller, upfront payments. In exchange for a percentage of the film's profits, it was a bold move. Studio heads thought he'd lost his mind. But when his movies became hits, like To Catch a Thief and North by Northwest, those small percentages turned into millions. Carson once laughed about it on The Tonight Show, saying, "Cary didn't just sign contracts, he invented them." But the brilliance didn't stop there. Grant understood timing, not just on screen, but in business. While most actors viewed television as a threat, he saw its future. Quietly, he began investing in TV manufacturing companies like Motorola and Magnavox, when television sets were still considered a passing fad. And when technology exploded after the war, those investments multiplied. He also put money into early aviation and pharmaceuticals, often through connections he made with his friend Howard Hughes. They didn't always get along, but Grant respected Hughes's vision. And he followed his instincts into industries that would define the modern era. Carson admired that about him. He once told a guest, "Cary Grant could turn a martini into a business opportunity." That line got a laugh, but it carried truth. Grant knew that fame was temporary. But wealth, if managed wisely, could last forever. And unlike many of his peers, he wasn't reckless with success. He retired from acting in 1966, still in his prime, to focus on his growing investments. While others chased roles, Cary Grant let his money do the acting. By the time he passed away in 1986, his estate was worth around $30 million. Roughly $650 million today. And what made it even more remarkable was that he earned much of that after leaving Hollywood. Carson once reflected on him during a monologue, calling him the man who made aging look like a business plan. Because even as the years passed, Grant never lost his composure or his fortune. He was proof that you didn't have to shout, scheme, or scandalize your way to the top. You could do it quietly, in a well-tailored suit with a smile, a handshake, and a little bit of foresight. As Carson put it best, Cary Grant didn't chase money. Money just liked being around him. And while Grant's story was one of quiet brilliance, the next legend on Johnny's list took a very different approach. She didn't just act her way into history, she fought her way into the boardroom. Up next, Joan Crawford, the boardroom queen who took over Pepsi. Johnny Carson once said, "Some stars marry rich." Joan Crawford married the boardroom. And he wasn't kidding. Joan Crawford wasn't just a movie star, she was a force of nature. She rose from poverty to become one of the most iconic faces of the Golden Age, famous for her intensity on screen and her iron will off it. But what most people don't realize is that Joan wasn't just collecting film credits. She was building a corporate empire. Carson often admired her transformation, calling her a woman who could turn a red carpet into a business meeting. And that's exactly what she did. After years of ruling the silver screen, Joan took on a new role, one that made Hollywood history. In 1955, she married Alfred Steele, the CEO of Pepsi-Cola. But when Steele passed away suddenly just 4 years later, most people expected Joan to fade quietly into retirement. Instead, she shocked everyone by stepping right into the company he left behind. Within months, she wasn't just the grieving widow of a CEO. She was on the board of directors of Pepsi-Cola, one of the first women in America to hold such a position. Carson couldn't help but comment on it once, saying, while most actresses were collecting Oscars, Joan was collecting dividends. As a board member, she traveled the world promoting Pepsi, blending her Hollywood glamour with sharp business instincts. She didn't just endorse the brand, she helped expand it, pushing for international marketing long before globalization was a buzzword. Behind the charm, though, Joan was fiercely disciplined. She was known to check receipts herself, even when she could have hired an army of accountants. One of her assistants once recalled her saying, "If you watch the pennies, the millions take care of themselves." It was a philosophy that would have made even Carson smile. But her financial genius didn't stop with Pepsi. Long before celebrities had brands, Joan licensed her name for everything from cosmetics to fashion to home decor. In a sense, she was one of the first to understand the power of personal branding, decades before it became Hollywood's favorite business model. Carson used to tease that she was the original influencer, except she didn't need a hashtag, just a close-up. And he was right. While other stars were fading into nostalgia, Joan was staying relevant and wealthy by reinventing herself as a businesswoman. By the time she passed away in 1977, her estate was worth around $25 million, the equivalent of over $500 million today. But more than the money, she left behind a legacy of independence, ambition, and unapologetic strength. Carson once summed her up with a grin, "If you ever found yourself across a boardroom table from Joan Crawford, you weren't in a meeting, you were in a movie, and you were the supporting actor." She was bold, brilliant, and utterly fearless. A star who proved that power could wear lipstick and pearls. But while Joan conquered the boardroom, the final name on Johnny's list conquered comedy and fooled an entire nation into thinking he was broke. Up next, Jack Benny, the comedian who was secretly a billionaire. Johnny Carson used to joke that Jack Benny was the only man who could make stinginess look like an art form. Every punchline, every pause, every "I'm not paying that," audiences loved it. Jack's miserly persona became one of the most beloved running gags in comedy history. But here's the twist Johnny always appreciated. Behind that penny-pinching act, Jack Benny was one of the richest men in entertainment. He wasn't just playing cheap, he was playing smart. Carson admired that kind of irony. He once told his audience, Jack Benny didn't waste money on jokes, he made money from jokes. That's real talent. In an era when most comedians worked for studio checks, Jack Benny was rewriting the rules. Long before anyone else, he realized that real wealth came from ownership. He founded his own production company, Amusement Enterprises, and it didn't just produce his radio show, it owned it. That meant the rights, the reruns, and the syndication profits all went straight to Benny's pocket. Carson once said that Benny didn't just tell jokes, he franchised them. And it was true. When Benny made the move from radio to television, he brought his entire library of content with him, something few entertainers ever managed. But his genius didn't stop at comedy. While everyone else was chasing glamorous investments like restaurants or nightclubs, Jack was quietly buying infrastructure. radio towers, broadcast equipment, even early telecommunications companies. He understood that the real gold rush wasn't in the shows themselves. It was in the cables and airwaves that carried them. By the 1960s, he was operating one of the first equipment leasing companies for TV production gear, renting cameras and lighting rigs to studios that couldn't afford to buy them outright. It was a brilliant, low-risk business model that brought in millions in steady revenue. Carson loved to tell that story. He'd laugh and say, Jack Benny was the only man who could make more money renting out a camera than using it. And while the audience laughed, Johnny meant it with respect. He saw in Benny something every entertainer secretly wanted: independence. Jack wasn't rich because of luck or inheritance. He was rich because he built a business that worked while he slept. By the time he passed away in 1974, Jack Benny's estate was worth over $55 million, around $1.2 billion in today's money. He had made a lifetime fortune pretending to be broke, and the world loved him for it. Carson once shared a moment from backstage in the early days of The Tonight Show. He said Jack had leaned over and whispered, "You know, Johnny, being cheap is the best investment I ever made." Then he winked, the way only Jack Benny could, and walked off to another round of applause. Johnny always smiled when he told that story. He said Benny was the perfect example of what old Hollywood got right. Talent, timing, and a little bit of cleverness could turn laughter into legacy. Johnny Carson believed that the magic of Hollywood wasn't just in the lights or the laughter. It was in the people who understood how fleeting fame could be and how lasting good sense was. These 7 legends, Chaplin, Pickford, Lloyd, Mae West, Cary Grant, Joan Crawford, and Jack Benny, each proved that talent could build wealth, but wisdom could preserve it. They didn't just make movies, they made history. And as Carson once said, they knew the real secret. You can't take it with you, but you can leave enough behind to make people remember your name. So while Hollywood today runs on billion-dollar contracts and viral fame, Johnny never stopped tipping his hat to the ones who came before, the dreamers who built empires with charm, wit, and a little old-fashioned showbiz nerve. Because in the end, as he liked to say with that familiar smile, they made the world laugh, cry, and fall in love. And somehow they made the banks laugh too.